Hello, my name is Alasdair Rutherford, and together with my colleague Alan Duggan at the University of Stirling, we're going to present some of our research looking at the financial vulnerability of Scottish charities during the COVID-19 pandemic. This research forms part of a bigger project, which is looking at financial vulnerability of charities across the UK, led by the University of Birmingham and also in partnership with the University of Southampton. So colleagues across the project have contributed to the analysis that we're presenting today. There's a lot of concern about how charities might be faring in the current crisis and comparisons to previous crises. In particular, some types of income streams, such as trading income, charity shops and so on, have been particularly affected by COVID restrictions, while we've also seen a big upsurge in support for charities, particularly through volunteering during the course of the pandemic. So one of the questions that we're interested in is what impact has this had on charities, on their sustainability, on their vulnerability, and what can the data tell us about the future? We're drawing here on administrative data, primarily from the Scottish Charity Regulator, OSCR, including financial data from charity annual returns, and looking at the patterns of this both pre-pandemic and as far as we can into the pandemic period. So we're going to present three sets of analysis for you this afternoon. The first one is looking at charity reserves, the reserves that charities have available. The second is looking at income dependence, how dependent charities are on particular income streams. And the third is looking at the registrations and dissolutions with the regulator to see how some of these financial vulnerabilities might have played out in the formation of new charities and in the deregistration of charities that are wrapping up. I'll pass now to my colleague Alan, who's going to talk about the first part of our analysis.
Hello, my name is Alan Duggan and I'm a research fellow at the University of Stirling, and I'll be talking to you first about unrestricted funds and total funds in the Scottish charitable sector. So first off, we're interested in reserve levels as a key measure of financial vulnerability for Scottish charities. So in this sense, charities with low levels of reserves can be financially vulnerable in terms of risk to service continuity, and they are likely to cut back their service delivery when they experience a financial shock. So conversely, charities with higher levels of reserves are more resilient and are able to maintain program output in the presence of fiscal shocks. And this is since they are able to smooth out temporary imbalances between income and expenditure. So unfortunately, we lack a direct data source for unrestricted funds in the Scottish charity sector in the period prior to the COVID pandemic. So this is because OSCR stopped collecting this data and information in 2016. So to try and get around this, we use three different samples of data. So we use total funds data and a subsample of unrestricted funds data collected for 2019-2020 to demonstrate the stability of unrestricted funds over time. And then we also use the 2019-20 subsample to give a snapshot of some headline figures for levels of reserves just prior to the onset of the pandemic. And then finally, we use unrestricted funds data for 2014-16, which is the last period for which we have full data collected by OSCR. And we use this to illustrate important predictors of reserve levels. And across all of our analyses, unrestricted funds is mainly measured as the number of months of expenditure our charity has in reserve. And this provides us with a standard method or measure to assess reserve levels across charities of different sizes. So in this graph, we chart the median and 10th percentile for both unrestricted funds and total funds over time using a balance panel, so using the same organizations over consecutive years. So we can see that levels for both of these funds, both total and unrestricted, are stable over time, and as well as being stable relative to each other. So this is also the case if we look at time trends across the sector, so using a repeated cross-sectional approach. The vertical dash lines that we see on the graph here indicate points at which the sample of charities change a bit, and this is based on reporting requirements in the OSCR forms. So in 2012, for example, the income threshold for charities changed from £100,000 to £250,000, and so after that point, the sample of charities will change in line with that, as smaller charities were no longer required to provide data that we could use in this analysis. So when we look at the graph as a whole, and we note that the stability of total funds after 2016 remains the same as prior to 2016, we think that this might lend confidence that reserve levels in the sector have also maintained a similar level of stability for the unobserved time period, so after 2015-16. So when we look at the headline findings, we're basing this on 3 different samples, as you can see here in this table. So the first sample is the 2014-16 data, so that's the last period for which we have full OSCR collected data. Then we also use the 2019-20 subsample that was collected for analysis in this project. And then we also matched the charities in the subsample from 2019-20 to the same charities in 2014-16 so that we can chart the levels of reserves over time for the same subset of charities. So when we look at the table here, we can see there is reasonable consistency across these key measures across all 3 samples. So in conjunction with the graph on the previous slide, this suggests fairly high levels of sectoral and within charity stability in reserve levels over time. So this offers some confidence that we can extrapolate findings using all 3 samples. And then when we look at key takeaways here, approximately half of all charities have less than 6 months in reserves, while between 25 and 30% have less than 3 months. Most notably, the bottom 10% of the sector likely had less than 35 days in reserves at the onset of the pandemic. So when we look at key findings by covariate using the 2014-16 data, we find that field of activity and charity age are significant predictors of reserve level, and these are also significant in regression analysis that controls for other covariates. So as we can see here, charity age has quite a significant effect, especially when we look at the oldest organizations in comparison with the youngest. And additionally, when we look at field of activity or ICMPO category, we can also see that there are significant differences based on field of activity. So areas like research and grant making tend to have higher reserves on average than areas like law and advocacy and employment and training. So when we look at key messages to take away from the analysis, first off, many charities did not have significant reserves available at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is particularly stark for the lowest decile of organizations. We also note that the longer organizations have been in existence, the more likely they are to have built up significant reserves. And we also see that there is notable variation between different fields of activity. So as noted, charities operating in research, religion, or grant making tend to have larger levels of reserve on average. And there is also relative stability in reserve levels over time, as we've demonstrated using the various different data sources. And this is both within sectors, within organizations and across the sector as a whole. Next, I'll be talking about income dependence and income diversification. So the logic of income diversification is quite simple and compelling. It hedges against uncertainty and provides flexibility in response to unstable environmental conditions. Charities with diverse income portfolios can be more resilient and able to smooth out temporary imbalances between different income streams. However, diversification is not without cost. So for example, administrative cost, mission drift, and exposure to unstable income streams. When we look at the measurements used in this analysis, the first is income dependence, and this is defined as the percentage of total income derived from a single income stream. So for example, we say that a charity has a dominant income stream if it receives at least 90% of total funding from a single income stream. So for example, donations or charitable activities. We also look at income diversification, defined as the degree to which total income is derived from one or more income streams. And to measure this, we use the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. This index is bounded between 0 and 10,000, with larger values indicating less diverse income portfolios. And in the analysis, we focus on the median of this index, which gives us an idea of diversification for the typical charity. These two measures, dependence and diversification, are also complementary. So, for example, a charity may receive funds from a range of income streams, suggesting a diversified income profile, yet be dependent on one of these for more than 50% of its annual gross income. When we look at some headline findings, first we note that 51% of charities have a dominant income stream. This means that 51% of charities have an income stream that accounts for 90% or more of their total income. We also note that field of activity, organization age, and largest income stream are important predictors of income dependence and diversification. We note that these are significant predictors in both descriptive and multivariate regression analysis where we're controlling for other covariates. And it's also notable that there is significant consistency between the significant predictors in this analysis and the predictors in the preceding reserves analysis. We also find that there's no significant effect in the multivariate analysis for charities filing after the onset of the pandemic. We use two different dates to demarcate the onset of the pandemic, and neither of them are significant in the model. This suggests that, at least at this point, there's no difference in income diversification for charities filing on either side of the onset of the pandemic. We also note that income dependence and diversification is stable over time. So this is within organizations and across the sector as a whole. So this graph shows us the Herfindahl-Hirschman index of diversification and shows us a distribution for charities in the sector. So on the horizontal axis, lower values indicate highly diversified income profiles, whereas higher values suggest concentration. So for example, one dominant income stream. Around 40% of organizations are almost entirely dependent on one stream for all of their annual income. So for example, when we look at the graph, a score of 8,000 or more represents a charity receiving approximately 90% of their annual income from only one income stream. Meanwhile, there's a short lower tail in the distribution such that around 12% of charities have some degree of income diversification, and we define that as being a score under 5,000. When we look at results for income dependence, we see that these look very similar to the results from the diversification index. So this table shows us the percentage of charities that have more than 50% or 90% of their total income come from one stream. And then on the left-hand side, we can see that this varies somewhat by which of the income streams is the largest income stream for the charity. So for example, we see that 16.5% of charities that have donations and legacies as their largest income stream have 90% or greater of their total income is derived from a single income stream. The most striking figures here are that over 95% of all charities have at least one income stream that makes up 50% or more of their total income, and over 50% of charities have at least one income stream that makes up over 90% or more of their total income. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, there may be particular concern for organizations that rely heavily on the trading or donations and legacies income streams, given the impact of lockdowns and restrictions on trading activities, as well as the effect of the economic downturn on people's capacity to donate. We also note very clear variations depending on the different fields of charitable activity in which organizations are active. So we use the ICMPO classification here. We note that over 3/5 of charities that are involved in law and advocacy work, housing, umbrella organizations, those classified as other, and those operating as grant-making foundations have a dominant income stream. And in contrast, when we look at the other end of this graph, we see that charities involved in culture and recreation, environment, and religion are the least likely to have dominant income streams. We also note a significant variation by charity age. This figure shows variations in the presence of a dominant income stream according to the age of the charity, and that's defined by the number of years since registration. So we see that older charities, especially in comparison to the youngest charities, have a much lower score, i.e. their portfolios are more diversified. So this may suggest that organizations diversify their funding base the longer they have been established. So when we look at some key messages to take away from this analysis, we note that there seems to be quite high levels of income dependence across the sector as a whole. We also note that the longer organizations have been in existence, the less reliant they are on a single income stream. We note that dependence and diversification vary significantly by field of activity. And we also see significant stability of levels of reliance over time. So there seems to be a high degree of stability in both dependence and diversification over time. And this is the case if we look at time trends using the sector as a whole, so using repeated cross-sectional approach, or if we looked at a balanced panel, which is looking at the same charities over consecutive years. So this gives us some indication whether individual charities become more or less dependent on a single income stream or pursue diversification as a strategy over time. Given the stability we see here, we also note that proposals that organizations need to become more entrepreneurial and diversify their funding sources may be neither helpful nor realistic in the absence of new or different sources of income.
Thanks, Alan. So now we're going to look at the registration and dissolution of charities. So the concern is that the financial vulnerabilities that we've heard about might play out into charities no longer being financially viable, having to wrap up and ceasing to operate. And in some degree, we know that that happened in previous financial crises. So we want to look at the pattern of these registrations and dissolutions in the Scottish Charity Register to look at whether we can see any signs of this happening in the current crisis. There's been a number of surveys of charities that have suggested the potential for quite big consequences, big hits to income, and a lot of concern among charity leaders about how viable their charities are, given the restrictions and the impact on income. We're interested then in the administrative data to seeing how this has played out. So firstly, the formations of Scottish charities. This shows the monthly figures, and we can see that's a lot noisier than the annual figures because there's quite a lot of seasonal variability, particular times of year when charities are more likely to be founded. You can see the vertical grey line representing March 2020 and the onset of lockdown for COVID-19. And while we see a bit of a spike immediately after that in the formation of charities, there then is a corresponding fall towards the end of 2020, and the numbers have been a little bit below the longer term average since then. So this is the same data again, only now the monthly numbers of charities being formed are represented by dots in the scatter plot. And what we've done is fit a statistical model to the data. So the blue line that you see there is fitted to the historical data. That's the trend in charity formations, and you can see it vary because there's a seasonal pattern, so it goes up and down with a regular pattern. We've then extended that blue line dashed into the post-COVID period as the prediction of the number of charities registered that we would expect if there hadn't been any COVID restrictions, if the pandemic hadn't happened. The red line shows the modelling fitted to the data that we observed, so the charity registrations that we've actually seen. So by looking at the difference between the red line and the dashed blue line, we can get a sense of how the number of charity registrations has differed from what we might have expected in normal circumstances. Now here is the monthly graph for charity dissolution. So this is charities being deregistered, removed from the Scottish Charity Register. And again, you see quite a lot of variability, but also some seasonal patterns, that there are particular months of the year when it's a little more likely that charities will be removed. But this pattern is a bit more striking, that both just before COVID restrictions and after the pandemic, the number of dissolutions has been lower than that longer run average. And here again, we have that data presented as a scatter plot with the dots being the monthly numbers of charities deregistered. And we've fitted the model to it with the solid blue line to show that trend. Again, you can see the seasonal patterns fluctuating, as well as a more general downward trend in the numbers of charities falling that are being deregistered. The dashed line represents March 2020, the onset of the pandemic, and we've extended our model with the dashed blue line to show the dissolutions that we might have expected in the absence of the pandemic. And then, same as last time, we've fitted a model to the data, represented by the red line, to show what the patterns that we've actually observed. And so what this suggests is that around the lockdown just after, there was a big fall in the number of charities that were removed from the register. But this is then increased and is now back to about what we would expect in normal times by the end of the period. This graph shows the trends in charity income growth and decline over time. And it shows it as growth rates on the y-axis. So a growth rate of 1 is essentially staying the same. 1.2 would be an increase of 20%, and 0.8 would be a decline in income of 20%. We can see that year to year, these levels of income growth are pretty stable. The distribution doesn't vary that much. So the one that we're particularly interested in is right at the end of the time period then, where we see across the board a big drop in growth. So there, the median charity has seen a decline in income. Even those charities that are growing the most, they're still growing, but they're growing by much less than they would in normal times. But particularly stark is the charities in the 25th percentile, where there's been a big drop in the growth, or a big increase in the decline in income, if you like. So that those charities experiencing the greatest declines in income, those have been particularly large in this year compared to previous years. So this shows quite starkly at the bottom of that distribution how that income has dropped off, and so that distribution of what's happening to charities has got much wider. The difference between the charities who are losing income and those who are gaining income has got bigger in 2021. So what does this analysis show? Well, we're certainly seeing fewer new charities that we might have expected without the pandemic. That didn't happen immediately, but there then seems to have been more of a drop off in the number of charities registering, and I think that's what we would expect. It takes a bit of time to conceive of and found a charity. That wouldn't be immediately affected by the start of lockdown, but some of the restrictions may have inhibited part of that process to start new charities, and we're now seeing that continuing. And there's not really a sign that that's been recovering back to normal levels. There was a significant drop in the number of charities being removed from the register early in the pandemic. And we'd probably expect that the process of winding up charities, of deregistering them, will have itself been disrupted by lockdown and by the restrictions. We have more recently started to see the number of those dissolutions coming back up to a more normal level, although it has been a bit slower than we might have expected, given all the financial vulnerabilities, all the risks and pressures on charities that we've heard about earlier this afternoon. Of course, in this pandemic, we have had a number of policies, such as furlough and some of the COVID-related grants that may have supported some charities in difficulty and put off that end point. And so there's more of a concern that as those have come to an end, that we might start to see a larger number of dissolutions. So in summary, what does our analysis show? Well, one point is that there's remarkable persistence over time in several of the measures that we look at. That there are quite stable reserve levels, income dependence, and charity registrations and dissolutions over time. And when we looked at income growth, that also tends to be in its distribution quite stable over time. On one hand, we've seen a lot of increasing risk, the low levels of reserves, the high levels of income dependence, and the big drops in income growth, particularly amongst those charities seeing more extreme declines in income. But on the other hand, that hasn't played through yet into an impact on the number of charities that are being removed from the register or are being dissolved. There's some evidence that that's starting to catch up, but it's likely that there is still more to come. Now, the question that's difficult to answer is, will those numbers of dissolutions overshoot? Will we see larger numbers of charities being removed than the historical average as this plays through and as the various COVID supports have stopped or run out? It seems likely that we will to some extent. It's difficult to project forward with this data, but certainly looking at other jurisdictions and looking at historical data from previous recessions, we do tend to see a spike in the number of charities ceasing to operate when there's that sort of shock. This one is stranger because it's been more delayed, perhaps by the process of lockdown and restrictions itself. But even as those processes are moving, we still haven't seen that come through yet. What does seem likely is that that impact isn't evenly distributed, that there are going to be particular types of organisations and serving particular communities that are going to be more affected, and perhaps because of their dependence on particular income streams or the reserve levels that they hold. So we will need to pay good attention to the data to see where this is playing through and what support might be needed in order to help out vital organisations in difficult circumstances. Thank you very much for listening to our work. We'll be happy to answer questions in a bit. Thank you.